Welcome back, I'm Bill. I've got something a little different today. This is an Akron 132AG. It was made by the Akron Lamp Company. The valve information that I found online shows that it was patented in 1930, so we know that's about when production began. They were made at least until 1935. One source tells me, another source says they were made probably throughout the 1930s. The fact that every one I've ever seen has a mica globe on it suggests that they weren't made much later than that, because everybody was using Pyrex by the late 30s, I think. They came in a few different varieties. There are several different variations on the valve. This is painted. Others had nickel founts, which may even be more common. In the designation 132AG, the G meant that this was gasoline, and the A meant that it was painted. The nickel ones are just 132G. And this came out about the same time that ColeMan released their first instant light lanterns, the 220 and the 228. And Akron came out with a similar way of doing the same thing. The instant light technology that ColeMan had allowed you to light the lantern very conveniently without having to preheat the generator. Akron came up with their own version of it, although it's far more complex. Some would even say perhaps over-engineered, but it works. And I think their thinking was, however over-engineered it may be, the idea was that it would require less maintenance. It was less prone to clogging up. Those early 220s and 228s, the ones that are often referred to as slants, tended to get clogged up with particulates in fuel, which was a lot more common then than it is now. So anyhow, these never show up here in Canada, but I was down in the US at a ColeMan gathering in Washington and picked this up from another collector. And I thought I'd make a video here. We're gonna take it apart. I'll show you the valve. I think there will be people who will be interested in how the valve works. So once we've got it apart, I'll put that together with the illustration from the patent and go through how that works. And generally I'll clean it up and we'll get it running at the end of the video. First thing we'll do is take this nut off. You'll notice it has a plain nut. These have a different thread pitch. I think ColeMan's are maybe a quarter 18 and this is a quarter 28. And ball nuts for these are kind of made of unobtainium at this point. Actually, most of the parts of this lantern are. You'll notice it's a big hat lantern, and like ColeMan's 228, it's reflective underneath. It's painted white, whereas usually they were either green or black. We've got a mica globe. This is not the original globe that came on this lantern. The original, this one's seen better days, but it's not too bad. The original mica globes for Akron had a lighting door that slides up that had a mica panel in it, but we'll put a different globe on here before we're done. And now to get into this, these have a really neat design. I really like these. They're very simple, at least until you get into the valve itself. So there's a knurled nut down here, and that actually holds the whole burner assembly in place. So we just unscrew that and lift it up the generator, and then we can lift this off, clear the generator, and then bring it up here. You'll notice the generator has best angle to get this. If I lift it up, you can see the generator is narrow down here. Some people call that a baseball bat generator. And so you can lift the air tube and manifold burner assembly off, and it simply slides over that and comes out. There's an oblong hole back here that allows for clearance. So we'll set that aside and come back to it later. Now this, you can see it has a hex fitting inside there. So this screws down on the top of the valve and holds the burner assembly in place, but you can also lift it up and you can see this rather mangled area on the generator here where it's a bit thicker. This should be in a hex shape. So the idea is you simply lift this up, rotate it until it locks onto that hex, and then you can use that to unscrew and screw in the generator. Now, someone's monkey wrenched this a bit, And I'm hoping, and we'll have a look at it later here, I'm hoping I can file down the flats here and take some of these points off. And it won't fit perfectly. It'll never be quite the way it was, but I think I can get it back so it'll fit into this. But for the time being, I'm just going to grab this and turn it off. These generators, you can see the springs hanging out a little bit, which shouldn't affect the use. These generators, again, just about everything on here is unobtainium, as they say. The tops are brazed on, so you can't remove that like a ColeMan. And we'll see from the patent illustrations, there's a little bit of gas in there. It's got a mesh screen wound inside and then the spring inside of that. And this is probably not going to come out, and I'm not even going to try, because if it comes out and I can't get it back in, then we'll need a new generator. So we'll just lift this off. Now, the cleaning rod and needle, it's got sort of a worm gear setup here. If I rotate this, this is what makes it go up and down. Normally with the generator on there, it acts as an upper stop or a limit, but without the generator on there, I can just lift it up until it's free. And you can see it's cut for the gear that's inside here that we'll see in a little bit. Again, we want to be careful with that needle. You can't get these anymore. Take off this nut. And this nut just threads onto the top of the valve. And for now, we'll just leave it. You'll see there's a slot here, and that just, the burner frame just slides over and lifts off. It's a neat design. It's rather elegant. And now the collar comes off. This diamond pattern that you see here, as well as on the vent, is a unique Akron feature. And now we've got the valve. Now the only thing I've done to this lantern so far is I took the pump out and I oiled it, and I sprayed some carburetor cleaner down into the bottom of the pump tube, because I wanted to make sure that the fount held pressure, and the leather needed oiling, and the check valve was stuck. So that's all I've done, and I fixed that part. So now we're going to take this valve off, and I think it's easier to take the tip cleaner off. This just unscrews, and then the whole thing just pulls out, and there's I'm not sure if it's fiber, it almost has a leathery feel to it, but there's a little gasket on here, and then you can see the gear that raises and lowers the tip cleaner. I'm going to leave this on for now, and I'm going to use a big wrench on this. Now, this is a brass fount, so I want to be careful and put even pressure on it so I don't bend it in. I'm not sure if Akrons have a problem with that like some others do, but that came out pretty easily. Someone's probably taken this apart before. And there we go. And after we get this cleaned up, I will take this valve apart and we'll look at how this thing operates. So I'm going to set that aside for now. Fuel cap, simple. It looks to me like they've simply used an older fuel cap design from the days when, and they were probably still making those lanterns at the time, that required an external pump. So there's an opening here that would have had the screw-in pump fitting like you see on an old quick light. And now for the pump, this is nice. This is like an old ColeMan 220 or 228B. It's knurled, it just screws on. And you need to unlock the pump body, and out it comes. And again, you'll see this is a fair bit like a ColeMan. Actually, I think it's more like an AGM. I mean, this is all pretty straightforward. But there's no separate, as on a ColeMan, there's an air stem inside of this pump handle. and that air, and it's usually got a crimp here that grabs the air stem, and when you turn it, it threads it down into the check valve. It's all one piece, and this is what screws down into the check valve, and that seals the valve, so air isn't going to come back out. The pump leather, by the way, is, I believe, the same size as ColeMan uses. And then we've got a check valve down here, which is not really very visible. It's working, so I'm not going to take it out. I've talked to people about these, and I've heard too many horror stories. You can put a large screwdriver down there. I think with some modification, a ColeMan check valve tool will work. You'll just need a different threaded bit to fit down in there and thread into the valve. You can use a spade drill bit and stick it down in there, and it'll grab the check valve as well. But I have simply heard too many horror stories of people loosening the check valve and in the process breaking the bottom of the pump tube or putting a crack in there and causing a leak. It's common with these old brass founts. ColeMan didn't have much of an issue with it, but it seems that everybody else did. AGM is notorious. Old brass founts have stress cracks, and this does not. So I don't want to mess that up. So I'm doing as little as I can to this. So I'm going to leave the check valve in place, but otherwise we've got this all taken apart. So let's get into the valve briefly. I want to take it apart, and I also want to look at this burner tube, and then we'll start cleaning things up. So the burner tube, these actually that unscrewed rather easily, like a ColeMan. They will come out, and notice when the cap came off, the caps unscrew, the burner tubes unscrew. This was already loose. The vent stud comes out. The rest of this, this appears to all be one piece. This might be brazed in there, or maybe I suspect it's all cast. The longer air tube you can see is pinned in place, so that's a separate piece, but we're not going to take that apart. And this bit down here is also pinned in place, so we're going to treat this all as one part. And that's not going to come off that easily. We'll have to do something different with that. And the valve. This I'm going to put in a vise, and then we'll see if we can't turn that off. So we've got the vise, we've got the valve in the vise. I've got some cardboard here to protect it from the vise jaws, and let's see if we can break this free. They're usually really tight, and that wasn't as bad as I was expecting. So we can unscrew this. You can see there's a little needle here that we want to be careful with. And now, set that aside. So here's the hole for the tip cleaner actuator that goes in there. And this is where the main valve stem goes in. This is the pickup tube. It's just an open tube, unlike a ColeMan or an AGM. It's just an open tube. On some designs of this valve, I know this pickup tube will come out. On this, it appears to be, well, I can tell it appears to be soldered or brazed in place. And since these are unobtainium, I'm not going to chance trying to pull it out or do anything like that, because it doesn't want to pull out just with my fingers. So we've got this all apart. You might notice this is different. It doesn't look like anything I've ever seen before. The valve stem is interesting in that it's got a reverse thread on it. So if I put that in the, so if you notice, it turns the same way that you would expect. So you turn it anti-clockwise to open. But what ends up happening when you turn it anti-clockwise on a ColeMan, say, or an AGM, you would expect when it's closed, the valve stem is extended all the way out here, and it plugs the hole in the valve body itself. But instead, this, when you open it, it actually moves. It's got a reverse thread. It moves forward, and you can see this flange coming out, and we'll see why that is later. And then when you shut it off, the valve actually retracts, or the stem retracts from the valve body. So it's the opposite of pretty much everything else I've ever seen. And so we'll get this cleaned up, and then we'll look at the patent diagram and show you how this works. So that's it for here at the workbench. I'm going to go put some of these things in the kitchen in citric acid to clean them up, and I will see you there. Welcome to the kitchen. I've got 2 pots simmering away here. They're full of relatively mild citric acid solution. This is what I use. It's something I pick up at a local beer and winemaking supply place. 1 kilo bag, I think it costs about $8. You can buy it on Amazon. You can buy it in smaller packets anywhere canning supplies are sold, like the grocery store. And I put in approximately a tablespoon per liter of water. And when it's hot, it just seems to work faster and better. I've got steel over here, mostly brass here. One thing I found on this Akron lantern, almost everything is brass, but there are a few pieces like these, the tip cleaner actuator and the valve stem and knob assembly and the plug down here. They're a combination of brass and steel, so sometimes you can't get around it. If you mix them up, you end up with the brass will it'll pickle your nickel, or vice versa, and you may not want that. You can polish it, but it makes life a little more difficult. So I try to keep them separate as much as I can. Also, be aware this is a pretty mild solution, but you want to be cautious. Things like pricker needles, I've seen them vanish in the space of half an hour if left in an acid solution too long. I have no idea how sturdy this thing is. ColeMan's usually not a problem, but I've seen others disappear. So I'm just leaving this in here long enough to sort of break through the crud, make it a little easier to clean up. And I'm taking it out. That also goes for the valve stem assembly. It's the citric acid has sort of broken down the grime that was on there, and I can clean it and polish it better. And this little needle here, I don't want that to disappear either, so I'm taking that out. And I think this is a fiber valve wheel. It's okay for a little while, but I don't want it getting just saturated through. It'll start to delaminate, so I'm going to take that stuff out. Now, if you've got questions about brass or steel, that kind of thing, you can always use a magnet. Usually it's pretty obvious. The magnet won't stick. That's non-ferrous. It's brass. On these other assemblies, the valve stem's obviously brass. I'm not sure if this is being drawn to the valve. I suspect it's being drawn to the valve stem through this nut, because it's just barely sticking to that, and it looks like there's brass under there. And of course the plug here is all brass. So you can use a magnet if you're not sure. Sometimes it really is difficult to tell if things are really dirty. So I'm going to let this simmer away. None of this stuff is particularly nasty. This lantern seems like it's been reasonably well maintained. I don't think it's ever really been thoroughly fettled like this. But I'm just going to leave stuff in here, maybe 10 minutes tops, just to break down the crud, make it easier to polish, and then I'll hit it with some steel wool. And I'll see you back when we're ready for that. Okay, so I've taken most of these things out of the pot, and I'm not going to show you how to steel wool everything, but this will give you an idea. You can see this was pretty black. You could tell it was brass or bronze, whatever it is, but a lot of the crud has come off. That's what the citric acid does. And then we just hit it with hit it with steel wool, and you don't have to do all of this. I like to do this on the lanterns, just make them look great. You could stop at this point if you wanted to. I take it to, we'll see in a few minutes, I take it to a buffing wheel on a bench grinder and polish it up so it looks really nice. But I expect probably at this point, with the steel wool and the citric acid, that's probably about factory at that point. They don't usually polish stuff to a high sheen, but I always like doing that. So It helps to have some of these things to have a brush here to get some of the really tenacious crud off of there. If it's not coming clean, I could probably put this in for a little bit longer, but I think a lot of that'll come off or when I put it on the buffing wheel. Like I said, you can now tell this is all one cast piece. This was in the citric acid about 15 minutes. You can go longer if you need to. Just keep an eye on things. The main thing in citric acid is anything that's nickel plated. It will eat through the nickel plating eventually. So if you can find a set of brushes, I won't do that on this, but I will. Probably see a lot of black stuff come out of there just like that. And kids, this is why when you're done with this, don't be a bad husband and leave the sink this way. Make sure you clean the sink up when you're done here. This is my buffing setup. I've just got a medium firm wheel, cotton wheel on my bench grinder. This one's starting to get a little bit worn, but it's still got some life left in it. And I just use some white jeweler's polishing compound, basically. Actually finally remembered to put some latex gloves on. These are actually really nice at this point. They help hold on to small parts so they don't get thrown out of your hands. So I'm going to turn this on, make some noise, and polish a few pieces up. put it in the citric acid to take the rust off, rubbed it down lightly with steel wool. It looks a lot better. This is one of those things I could leave it like this, or I could keep polishing it. It'll probably take the nickel off, but I could probably polish up the steel and make it look better. That's kind of up to you what you want to do with it. This gives you an idea of the polishing process and what I do and what you can do, and I'll meet you back at the workbench. Well, we've got all of our parts cleaned and polished, and it's just the fount left. So this has some paint loss. It's brass, but it's not bad. Especially this side looks pretty nice, especially considering its age. Like they only say it's only original once. So this really, you could repaint it if you want, but it's really not that bad that I'd want to do that. So what I'm going to do is polish it, bring back the shine, get rid of the oxidation. It will probably also bring some of this brass out that's showing through the paint, so it'll be shiny. You may or may not like that look. If you wanted to, you could clear coat it, but since the paint isn't flaking off or anything like that, it seems very stable and solid as it is. I'm not going to opt to clear coat it. Again, I'd prefer to keep it as original as possible. So what I'm going to use to polish it is this Mother's Mag and aluminum polish. It's a metal polish, but I found it works extremely well on paint and gives a much finer polish and shine than using, say, automotive paint polish. I've tried that. This works faster, and quite honestly, I think it works better. So I'm just going to start down here and then when I'm done, I can put a coat of wax on it, and that'll help protect it. So just, you can see it takes off a little bit, but this isn't like polishing with, say, steel wool or something where you can burn through the paint really quickly. So let me just polish this off. And I'll keep doing more, but you can see the big difference that makes right there, just in terms of shine and getting rid of all the oxidation. So to wax this, I'm just going to use some paste automotive wax. It'll be just fine. Okay, we'll let that sit for a minute and then we'll wax off. All right, that wax is dry. Let's wax off. I can see some spots that could use a second coat of wax. So I'm going to go ahead and hit it one more time. And I'm not going to film all of that, but when we come back, we will look at the valve and the theory of operation. Let's talk theory of operation. This lantern's very different from any other ColeMan or AGM lantern I've worked on. And I thought this would be helpful. Maybe other people are working on one of these and wanting to know what's going on, how it works. So I am indebted and must give thanks to the gentleman in the Akron Lamps and Lanterns page on Facebook who directed me to this patent illustration. And then from this I was able to find the actual patent description written by Chester A. Hoff. And reading through the rather complicated description, I was able to sort out what's going on here, because this is just kind of crazy. So here we've got our nice shiny valve, and we've got the valve stem. Make sure you can see it. The way that this is their Insta-Glo, it's like the instant light. The way it works is you've got your fuel pickup here. This is a lamp, but actually the patent on this valve is the same as the patent on this illustration, and in the description he notes that it could be used on multiple types of devices, lamps, lanterns, or whatever. But you've got your fuel pickup, what you see here in the fount. It runs up to the valve. Now, in the bottom, inside here, there's a hole. I can't find it. I can blow carburetor cleaner in here and it'll come out the bottom, so I know the hole's there. But what happens is fuel, you pressurize the fount. This used a manual pump. Our lantern has a built-in pump. But the air pressure in the fount, when the valve is opened, it forces the fuel up through this pickup tube, this tube right here, into the valve body, and into this chamber back here. Now this illustration would be with the valve kind of like that, and the valve stem going into it there. So what happens, this is a mixing chamber back here. This area right here, this cross-hatched piece, that's the valve stem. What's interesting is normally the fuel would come up into this chamber. On a ColeMan, it basically, you back out the valve stem and it opens up the flow and the fuel runs up here into the generator. On this, given no obstructions, the fuel comes up through the tube. When the valve is opened, the valve actually moves inward instead of outward. And this flange here moves inward and opens up this cavity around the valve stem. Fuel runs through here, down this narrow little passageway, and it comes out, and I'm hoping you can see the hole. There's a little hole. Sorry, it's on this end of it. There's a little hole right here. So when you open the valve, and it's kind of interesting because this valve is reverse threaded, so when we open it, I'm hoping this stays in focus and you can see, as we open it, that tapered bit moves inward, so it's moving inward into the lamp. So fuel runs up here into that chamber, goes behind here, runs down along the valve stem, and then it meets this channel and comes out here, and that's this little hole here. Now, once it's in that hole, this screws into here like such. Come on, there we go. So that hole opens into this groove. The fuel flows around that groove, enters this hole here, which is pictured right here, and from there, this hole has a passage that runs straight back into the main shaft that goes up to the generator. So the fuel comes out that way. So without any obstructions, the fuel runs up, down along the valve shaft, down through this passage, through that hole, around that circular recessed thing, and then through this hole and over to the generator and out. Now, the whole point of the Insta-Glo or instant light systems are so that you don't have to preheat the generator, because if fuel just flows straight up through all of that and it hits the generator and the generator's not hot, it's not going to vaporize and it's going to flood and you get a fireball. That's why the old quick lights, or the predecessor to this lantern, the 103 I believe it's called, you had to use a torch or matches or something to preheat the generator so it didn't flood when you opened the valve. So what Mr. Hoff came up with in this case, notice the valve stem has a tapered, I guess that would be a flange, on either side. So on this side, when the valve is closed, it shuts off the flow of fuel. That's this right here. It closes up against that chamber that allows the fuel to go through. Now, if you open it, it screws in just a bit. Now, this is open, so fuel can flow through, but what's also open, the other side, the other taper on there, isn't seated all the way in this hole. And this is the hole that you see down on the bottom here. I know it's going to be hard to see on there. What's happening is up in here, there's a little air hole. So that air you've pumped into the top of the fount to pressurize and force the fuel out, a little bit is going to run through this passage, and then it comes into the back of this chamber through a little hole. And according to the patent, this little needle here, which is pictured here, is used to create turbulence as air rushes up through that hole, hits the needle. And what happens is air mixes in, well, they call this the mixing chamber. So now it's not just straight fuel running up from the fuel pickup along this passage and down. Now you've got air, as long as this valve is in the middle and isn't closed on both sides. Air runs up here, mixes with the fuel, and as Mr. Hoff says in his patent, it moves along here, down here, around this circular pattern here, out the top hole and into the generator. And he calls that a tortuous passage. But what it does is it results in mixing the air with the fuel so that you're not getting straight fuel. ColeMan's has a deal down here at the bottom of the fuel and air tube. They call it a fuel and air tube, where air enters the top, runs down. There's an air stem that meters the fuel flow, so you just get a tiny bit of fuel leaking in. The air picks that up, turns it into droplets, and carries it to the generator. This mixes air with the fuel and accomplishes a very similar purpose. So that's how this works. You can go online and you can look up this patent and for yourself and read it as well. It took me about 3 times through following all the numbers on the diagram. But it's really quite ingenious. I don't know how they come up with stuff like this, but that's how it works. So that's theory of operation. Now let's put this lantern back together, put some gas in it, put some mantles on it, and fire it up. All right. Let's put this lantern back together. Start with the easy part. Fuel cap goes on there. I don't know if it's had a fuel cap gasket replaced or what the deal is, but the one that's on there is working, so I'm not going to replace it. And let's put the pump back together. So we've got the pump handle or shaft, the cap, the spring. Got a large washer that goes above the leather. The leather's been sitting in leather conditioner this whole time, and I never did take out there's a little brass ring in there so it doesn't get crushed. We'll put that back on. It's a small washer that goes inside so that it keeps its shape, and then a nut that holds it all in place. And get a steady grip on it. We'll screw it back together. And this is all nice and supple. It's lubricated. You can use pretty much any lubrication you need. In a pinch, you can even use cooking oil, vegetable oil, something like that. Don't use vegetable oil unless it's an emergency. You want to use something else. Vegetable oil goes rancid and gets sticky and then hardens. I use a leather conditioner on here and then 3-in-1 oil, which I've always found works great. ColeMan used neat's foot oil. I imagine other lantern manufacturers probably did too. If it's an emergency, I've used oil for my dipstick in the car while camping. Just unless it's an emergency, don't use vegetable oil. So feed that guy down in there. Get it started, and then we'll screw the cap down. Perfect. All right, now I've already put the valve back together since I needed to put that in the vise to get this plug on tight enough and straight. So the valve has been reassembled. I noticed this was, the pickup tube was a little bent and misshapen when I took it apart. And I also noticed that the bottom of the burner frame right in here was pulled downward, which suggests to me that this should be sitting right on top of the valve body and it shouldn't be compressed down. And so that tells me the collar was sitting higher than the valve was. So somebody screwed the valve in too far and then put that nut on there and tightened it down until it wouldn't go anymore, until it was flush with the top of the valve, and that deformed the burner frame. And I think that was also part of the reason why this whole thing was a little bit lopsided. So I don't want to screw in the valve that far. The problem is, because someone's already screwed it in and over tightened it, the threads are stretched. Not a lot, but a little bit. So I'm going to use this blue Permatex thread locker, and I'm going to put a little bit on the threads here so that it works its way in. And then I'm also going to put some on the threads here. And by the time I've got this put together, it should harden. This is not the permanent thread locker. This is stuff that will seal it and hold it tight. So just in case it's not all the way in there, it'll be in there enough. So from all the pictures I've seen, yep, and that's where I want it, right there. All the pictures I've seen from Akron, the pump should be to the left of the valve. So hopefully everything will go back together better this time. So long channel goes over the valve stem, so we'll put the collar on. It polished up pretty nicely. And then we'll put this nut that holds the burner frame on. We'll put that guy on first. And now when we put the burner frame on, this is the channel for the air tube. And it needs to be free. So we don't want to put it on this way because then the air tube is going to bottom out on the valve. So we'll just set that in the channel, move it back. All right, now before we tighten it, we'll make sure the collar is centered on the fount, and we'll make sure that, you know what? This tells me we need to go one more turn on the valve. Because it's just right. It's sitting a little bit too high. So let's try this again. Collar centered. That's perfect. And we'll just tighten everything up. I'm going to put in the tip cleaner. And that just screws down. The gear in there will grab that. And the generator. Now I'm rather happy with this. I realized that someone had, when they wrenched on this, had squashed the generator out of round, and that's why it was no longer seating into this hex. So I actually just sort of squashed the generator back and then cleaned up the edges on this, and it's working now. So we will carefully thread this, since the spring is hanging out just a little bit, making sure it doesn't hang up on the inside going in. And we will screw that on. Perfect. And now the burner. So this tells me, once I started cleaning these up and polishing them, I can see someone's had a wrench on here. So it could be something as simple as, you know, getting hot and then cooling and hot and cooling and all that over the years. These do work loose. And someone may have just put a wrench on there, and of course someone for whom this is a user doesn't care what it looks like, or may not. And they just put a wrench on there and squashed it. But I suspect it was someone who was a little careless doing a rebuild or something on this. Notice I've got tape on my pliers so I don't make these any worse than they already are. And we'll put the vent stud in. Make sure that's tight. And now this part that I like. We just drop that down into the channel, pull it forward, make sure it sits on top of the generator, and then we just nuts. There we go. Drop that knurled nut down. Get it started. If we can get it threaded. I see it's crooked. There we go. That's really an elegant design, I think. And it's on there. Now, this is a reproduction mica chimney for a ColeMan quick light, but it's a little bit tall, but it'll fit on here. This has the metal lighting door. The Akron ones have a similar lighting door, but it has a mica panel in there, so there's no light obstruction. And we'll put the vent on. I think that looks pretty good. So now, let's tie some mantles onto this. I'm using these Peerless 2CHGs. They're decent mantles. They're equivalent to a ColeMan number 21, and I think they're a bit better quality than the currently made ColeMans. Spread some of these gathers around just a bit. Let's see, new Peerless. The old Peerless had a little Peerless P on them. These don't seem to have that anymore. All right. Now I'll gas it up, burn these in, and we'll see about lighting it. All right, so I've got the mantles burned in, we've got gas, we've got pressure. Let's see if this guy will light up. Maybe. Here. Can hear there's these generators when they've just been cleaned keep wanting to clog up. There we go. Oh, it didn't even flare. All right, let me turn the light off. Now that's a thing of beauty. Roughly 1930, 1935, running again, running pretty nicely too. So, thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful. See you next time.